Let's talk about this economy and what is happening. The data don't look good right now. Can you put this data in context for me? We are now getting a policy response. How much worse does it have to be before we get a full throttle policy response?
I think the number is bad. There's no question about it. If you look at all front, it's all very weak. But I think you have to also you have to also pay attention to the fact that if you think about the Chinese production side actually is stronger than the demand side. The reason I'm saying that,
Yep.
if you think about the Chinese export, and actually the number that are released a few days ago was very strong. We're talking about double digit. Whereas if you think about retail sale, everybody understand the number, 2.7%, but actually that is a nominal number. If you think about real number, you have to take out inflation. Most likely, the Chinese consumption have already grown at 0%. So we have a pretty stagnant domestic demand, but at the same time, demand supply side is doing reasonably well. That's my feel. Yeah.
Hey, Chen, it's good to see you, by the way. What does Xi do? What is Xi thinking? How is this solvable?
I think the problem here is that he's a strong man. There's a strong man syndrome. He does not care. For example, the property, as your economist just pointed out, the property market is really in deep trouble. And we know that lots of people don't want to pay their mortgage anymore. And you can see the sales are slumping. And then the Chinese government really does not really care about it, because Xi Jinping already told the people, the public, that the property is for people to live in, not for people to flip, meaning not for you to sort of speculate. So that's why I think you can see the policy response to that is very, very muted. So I think your economist is absolutely right. I think the property slowdown or controlled implosion is by design. It's not really out of a panic. You can see that there's no panic in the Chinese government. Even the rate cut is like 10 basis points. Is nothing. It's completely joke, in my view.
Okay. The authorities seem to be leaning on the authorities seem to be leaning on the banking sector. The idea being that the banking sector can extend more credit, it can allow the developers to finish properties, those properties can then be solved, and this controlled implosion can work in a controlled fashion. Does the banking system have the capacity to extend significantly more credit, though? How tapped out is the Chinese banking system?
So you got to understand one critical thing here that is very different from us in the West, which is the Chinese state-owned commercial banks. Their balance sheet is interconnected with People's Bank of China. So that's why you never see a banking crisis in the state-owned enterprise, in the state-owned banking sector, because their balance sheet is completely connected with People's Bank of China. If you have a bad loan, the People's Bank of China will provide unlimited amount of liquidity to all those state-owned banks. So that's why I think we should put that under arrest, meaning on arrest, basically saying the Chinese banking system is going to go into a major implosion. I don't think that's going to ever happen.
So, Chen, here's my question is, why don't the markets care? Like, I appreciate the fact that commodities are getting squashed, and that's definitely in reaction to the data. But this is a relatively bleak picture that we're outlining here. And I'm just wondering, like, where should the reaction be felt, and when should that reaction be felt?
Yeah, I think it's a very good question here. I think the slowdown or the near stagnation of the Chinese economy is actually very good for global fight against inflation. After all, we need a cooler demand, but stronger supply. That's exactly what you got from the second largest economy in the world, which basically saying the Chinese demand is really, really crappy, whereas the supply side was doing reasonably okay. So that is a good for global fight against inflation, number one. Number two, if you think about it, commodity prices. I mean, it's really bad for commodity prices if you think about the Chinese economy, the performance of it. So I think from that regard, it's also good for inflation coming down around the world. In addition, I do believe that what's going on in China, what is going on in the Chinese economy is very bullish for the treasury bonds, because it's really the Chinese economy has to pump a lot of disinflationary pressure into the global system because they don't have domestic demand. They have to rely on the global demand to let the production machine running. So that's why they're probably going to cut prices. They're going to disinflate, which is working out actually quite well for the global inflationary story. So I think commodity is a pretty negative for commodity. That's a pretty given. And finally, I think it's going to be marginally bullish for the U.S. dollar.